We have our final candidate, the Reverend Canon Lucinda Ashby. So welcome this evening, and we are just going to get started with the questions, which you already know.
I guess I need to use the microphone?
Yes,
okay.
you do.
If I start waving it around and it becomes distracting, just let me know.
So, first question, as a bishop, who in your past or present would be your personal role model? What do you find most admirable in their style of life and leadership?
So I'm going to go personal on this. My role model has been my mother. My mother was raised in the Midwest, and this is better? Good. And she was raised in the Methodist Church by her mother, who was a pillar of the community, you can imagine. And my grandmother would bring missionaries home for lunch after the church service because they travel around and talk in Methodist churches. And so my mother grew up listening to the stories of missionaries around the table and decided she wanted to be a missionary when she grew up. However, in the 1950s, it was very important that one become a 1950s housewife. So my mother tried to do that and was not very successful at it, and eventually dragged my father onto the mission field. Now in those days, the male was the missionary and the female was the missionary wife. But that didn't matter to my mom. She figured she could do it anyway. And off we went to Latin America. When we were in Peru, the way that my mother raised us was, you need to be humble, you need to listen, and you need to learn. That was a very important lesson for us. While we were on the mission field in Peru, my parents' marriage fell apart. And my mom had to take her 4 children and bring them back to the States. And because missionary wives, and you're not supposed to be without your husband. So because in Peru at the time the father owned the children, what that meant was that my mother had to bribe the officials in order to get us out of the country. She successfully did that, and we ended up on a plane and eventually ended up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where a nice missionary man in a station wagon came and picked us up and took us to a school in northern New Mexico. My mother, as a single mother, raised her 4 children in this mission school. Again, we were taught, you're to be humble, you're to listen, and you're to learn. Now, my mother is 87 years old. She has never stopped being a missionary, well, maybe officially, but not unofficially. This is her calling, this is her ministry. And she lives in a retirement community now. And what she does is on Mondays, every single Monday, she goes to the Alzheimer's unit and works there to read stories to the people who are there and to sing songs with them. And when I grow up, I want to be just like her.
Great, thank you. Second question, what has been your experience with using community organizing tools to seek ways to engage and minister with people outside the walls of the church? And would you encourage ECR to further embrace community organizing?
When I was a rector in Sacramento, California, this was before community organizing was the phrase that you used. At that time, that parish was in the middle of a neighborhood that had a Title I school across the street. So the kids were on 100% lunch program. It had gangs. It had a lot of homelessness. There was a lot of domestic violence. There were a lot of really hungry people. There was a lot of poverty. It was just an amazing place. And we were the gospel in that neighborhood. We had a food closet. we had a clothes closet, we had a health clinic, and we had a parenting resource center. And half of that was started by, or supported or led by a wonderful deacon. What we had to do in order to support this, because we couldn't do this by ourselves, we partnered with local agencies. So we partnered with the library, we partnered with the Child Abuse Prevention Council, we partnered with the police department, we partnered with everybody and anybody, other parishes, other organizations, anybody that we could, in order to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick in prison, and welcome the stranger. And out of that, there was constant advocacy going on, because these were life and death situations, and these people needed to be cared for. And we had to partner effectively with both governmental agencies and with nonprofits in order to make this work. What I see now is something that gives me heart, which is the fact that the church is talking about community organizing and is developing a program around that that's very effective. I serve as Dean of the High Desert School for Ministry, which is the local formation program for people in ordination process. It's a partnership with Eastern Oregon and Idaho. In that, as part of that, I am really working to make sure that community organizing is part of the curriculum, because these people, these clergy, these men and women who are going to become clergy leaders, leaders in their communities, need to be able to have the skills so that the church is at the center of the community that it is serving. It's like the spoke of the wheel, engaged with all the agencies around it and advocating to make sure that people are clothed and fed and sheltered and cared for. And this is really an important part of who the church is becoming.
Great, thank you. Next question. Many of our parishes have implemented and practice open communion, in which all, no matter where they are in their spiritual journey, are welcomed to receive communion. Please discuss your position on open communion. What would your directions to diocesan clergy be on this issue?
Thank you. Well, I can tell you that I have never knowingly violated a canon. And I can also say that I have never checked a baptismal certificate at the altar. I have seen someone do that. That's another topic. You know, what I see when I stand in front of a congregation and I say, the gifts of God for the people of God, what I see are people who come forward with their hands outstretched. And they come to the altar and they have those hands outstretched and they rub arms with the person beside them, and the body of Christ is gathered. You know, it doesn't matter to me if they are someone who is a CNE, meaning they come for Christmas or Easter, someone who is seasonal, somebody who remembers to come once in a while, somebody who comes all the time, whatever. That doesn't matter to me. What matters is that they're there. What I would say is that I think it's really important to be pastoral, to have a generous pastoral response, to err always on the side of generosity. People need to be invited to participate in the sacraments of the church. Now, let's say that I were to find out, hypothetically, that someone was taking communion but hadn't been baptized. I want to know why. Is it possible that they didn't feel invited? Is it possible that they didn't know what it meant? Is it possible they didn't know anything about baptism? That's a conversation that would need to be had. It also could be possible that they don't want to be baptized, and they may have very good reason for that. I've encountered that before. What I would say to the clergy is always err on the side of generosity. Give a response to your congregation that is faithful. Be faithful to your context. Care for your people. And always look for an opportunity to invite people into the sacraments of the church.
Thank you. Next question. What might be your vision of working with a council of deacons rather than an archdeacon, and what is your vision of how the diaconate in ECR might develop and expand?
I love this question, and I love this idea. I really love this idea. I love to work with teams. So for me, there's nothing better than a team working together. Think about the diaconate. So the diaconate is this amazing calling that is unique to every single person that is called to it. This is ministry outside the walls, and it takes a whole bunch of different gifts and different ways of doing things and some rather quirky people here and there. I mean, it's really an amazing calling. Put a whole bunch of deacons around a table and talk about the possibilities for ministry and mission in the diocese outside the walls of a church, and think of what could happen. The innovation, the opportunity, the creativity. It could be absolutely amazing to do this. And it's a heck of a lot better to meet with a whole bunch of people than to have one person holding a meeting inside their head. So I really love this idea. And I think that I know that, not a lot of people do it or whatever. It's just such a great idea that it doesn't really matter if it's the way you're supposed to do it or not. It's just a really, really good thing. I've worked with some really great deacons in my life, and they have taught me so much. And one of the things that I have learned for them is something that I carry as a dream. And this is my dream. I dream that every single congregation would have at least one deacon. Think of what this diocese would look like if we had this going on. Think of how the church would move into taking its place at the center of the community. Think of the possibility for creative new ministries. Think of who we are becoming. What an amazing opportunity. Council for Deacons, I vote yes.
Thank you. Another long one. Please tell us about your theology and practice of Christian stewardship and your views about the biblical tithe. Do you personally practice the tithe? Would you put a priority on energizing attitudes about stewardship, and how would you do this as Bishop of ECR?
So let me tell you what I do. As canon to the ordinary and working with parishes as I do in transition ministry and congregational development, among many other things, there are certain parishes that I work with for a long period of time. And so what I do is every year I tithe to a parish that I'm working with. And I love to stand up there on that particular Sunday and ask for a pledge card and say, here is my tithe. And this year it is yours because I believe in what you are doing. That actually helps raise the tithes in the parish, the pledges in the parishes, by the way, if a leader does that, which is just a wonderful byproduct. But I think one of the things that we really are challenged with still in the church, despite the materials that come out from the Episcopal Network for Stewardship, despite the links that are on our websites, we are challenged to help our leaders our congregants, people all over, to understand that stewardship is a year-round, lifelong way that we live life. It is not the pledge card. There's still some confusion about that, but a pledge card is a money part, and then there are these other parts. Stewardship, care of creation, is one of the most important parts of stewardship that we really need to be attending to. We cannot be lazy about that. We are also looking at care of our buildings and grounds as they are needed to support the mission and ministry of the church. We need to take care of our relationships, our familial relationships, our friendships. We need to be good stewards of that. We need to be good stewards of leaders in the church. That's essential. And we need to be good stewards of our homes. For example, the house that I live in, I take really good care of. And when I sell that house, the person who comes along behind me and buys that house is going to be very happy that I've been a good steward of my property. So these are all elements of stewardship that are important. You know, I had a friend a while back who said something marvelous to me. He said, you know, every time you preach the gospel, there's a stewardship sermon. I thought, what a great preaching challenge. And that's something in the conversation about stewardship that I would really challenge our clergy to do. Because stewardship is not a bad thing. It's a very important thing and very valuable, and we ought to be preaching it.
Thank you. And your final question, as bishop, what would you do to address shrinking, aging congregations that are moving towards unsustainability?
I'm going to tell you a story. It's one of my favorite stories, and I've told it before. So I've been in Idaho about 2 seconds. Now that's an exaggeration, but I hadn't been there very long. And a man came in, and he had a set of keys, and he put them on my table, and he said, "We're done." And I said, "Who are you?" Well, his name was Chad. And Chad was from a tiny parish located in the high desert, way up in the middle of nowhere, with a town of 982 souls. And what Chad told me was that the town was in deep decline. And he had a very sad story that he told, and we listened, and I listened to him for quite a while. And then, to his chagrin, I picked up the keys and I handed them back to him. And so he went and drove the 200 miles or whatever it is back to Arco. I was not too far behind him. And so I went to the parish, they're all parishes in Idaho. I went to the parish in Idaho, in Arco, and there were 5 other people there. And so the 6 of them and the 1 of me, we sat down together. And these 6 people were kind of wondering what the heck was going on. And I said, "Tell me about yourselves. Tell me what you do." And they said, "Well, we do morning prayer on Sunday, and we have sermons. And then in the afternoon, we go to the nursing home, and we do a service. And then on Mondays, we have an ecumenical Bible study, but the Presbyterians don't like it. And on Tuesdays, we have a craft class with the Mormon women. We have an emergency food bank that we run for the community. We have Holy Week with the Baptists, and we run a clothing closet type thing with the Baptists as well." And I looked at them, the 6 of them, and I said, "You are doing exactly what God has called you to do in this place, in this community, at this time. You're not supposed to look like the cathedral. You're not supposed to look like big old St. Luke's, Idaho Falls. You're supposed to look like you, right where you are. A year later, we were at Deanery Days in the Eastern Deanery, and there's always time for the parishes to talk about what they're doing. And so they were telling us about the craft fairs and thrift store and the rummage sales and all the things that were coming up. And it was Chad's turn, and Chad stands up and he unfolds his scroll. It sort of looked like that. He unfolds his scroll and he starts going down the list. And as he's talking, the jaws around the room were just dropping. And I said to him, "And Chad, how many people do you have?" And he said, 13. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing in the community that God had called them to serve. That's what was going on.
The Reverend Canon Lucinda Ashby, and I'll give that back to you. Thank you very much for this evening.
Thank you.
And I will ask, Madam Moderator, do we have time for one more question? Okay, who would like to ask a question?
Yes.
No, hang on, we'll see. We're holding off on Mary because she asks a lot of questions. But hang on, let's see if somebody else has anybody? Okay, Mary, you can go.
I think you wrote the manual for churches going through transition, is that correct?
I did.
Great. I've been asking a question about what would you do as bishop if you were here, because we at present have about 14 congregations in transition, including our cathedral with the dean having left. That's a lot. So what would you do to help bring calm and order for all those people going through that much transition at the same time?
That's a really good question. And thank you for pointing that out, because any congregation going through transition, there's a heightened sense of anxiety and concern. Because I have so much experience with working with transition, I think it's really important and calming and helpful for people to understand that I do understand that. When I'm working with a parish in transition, I'm with them as diocesan transition minister more than I am with any other parish in the diocese. As bishop, I would not have that opportunity, but one thing I can do is make sure that the people doing transition, and I know you have Brian Nordwick, but I'm hoping you have other consultants as well who can help with that, are really skilled in terms of walking beside congregations in transition, that the most important thing that we do during a transition is remain relational, deeply relational with a congregation. I have, my phone goes off and I've got the senior wardens of all those congregations in my phone, which I don't think is going to change very much if I were to become bishop. And so that accessibility is one thing. Another thing is that there's a dance that one works with a congregation in transition. It's a secret art form. This art form is knowing when to move and when to hold back. Sometimes if you engage with a congregation and respond too much to the energy that is anxious energy, you can create more anxiety. And so knowing that there's that, but also knowing when it is time to move is also very important. You can't underestimate what is going on there. So what I'm talking about are things that are relational. We have to accept that it's anxiety time. We have to name it. When I go for a visitation and I'm preaching, I have no question about, no hesitation to name what is there and to bring that forward. And also bring a lot of encouragement and a lot of hope, because transition time is creative time, and transition time is opportunity time. So knowing that there's so much that can be brought to a congregation that really brings them forth into the area of health. 14 is a lot. It's a high percentage in a diocese. So we're going to have to be very mindful of that in terms of the conversations that we have. When you have that many parishes in transition, it's not necessarily always the best time to try some great new big huge thing. So we just need to be mindful of that and careful of that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Canon Lucinda, thank you very much.